which is from Desiree S Coleman, a DE&I leader with a Fortune 50 financial services company. And a little information about Desiree before she joins us here on the virtual stage. Desiree is a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader at a Fortune 50 company. Her superpower, this is such a wonderful piggyback from our last session, and it was already in here. Her superpower is helping organizations redefine and reimagine their DE&I practices while operationalizing their values. Drawing on her experiences in the corporate, government, and nonprofit arenas, she also coaches, mentors, and invests in women leaders. Desiree is the recipient of the 2019 Rising Star in D&I Award from Investment News. She was also named Hive's 2020 Top Diversity and Inclusion Leaders of North America and received the Diverse Business Leaders Award, Business Leaders Award from the St. Louis Business Journal. And I'm sure plenty more to come. So I'm very excited to welcome Desiree to this stage. And she'll be talking about creating equitable spaces for women of color in the workplace. With that, I would love to hand the mic over and have you get started, Desiree.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me, Charlene. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and happy April, which is also Celebrate Diversity Month. So thank you for joining me for this conversation, and special thanks to Charlene for inviting me to discuss ways we can create equitable workplaces for women of color. So I'd like to start by introducing myself on the next slide. Again, I'm Desiree S Coleman. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, which is on Kickapoo Native land. I'm a speaker, I'm a writer, but my most important role is mom. So those two beautiful brown girls that you see there, showcasing girl powers, represent my two beautiful, amazing daughters who are my why. They inspire me. They also fuel my passion for advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when I think about the things that ground me, it's really my faith, my family, and my friends. And so if you are following on social media, I invite you to tag me at Desiree S Coleman. I guess I should know my own name, Desiree S Coleman. So let's discuss how we'll spend our time today. My goal is that after participating in this discussion, you'll have a greater understanding of intersectionality and the cross-section of gender and race issues, and also be able to identify ways that you can personally dismantle bias when you see it and leverage yourself as an ally within your place of influence. So we'll start by doing an introduction and some framing. We'll talk about what the research says. I'll share a little bit about my experiences. And then we'll talk about practical application and specifically what you can do from your place of influence. So as we delve into the conversation today, you'll see here on the next slide, I'm grounding us in a quote by Audre Lorde. And she says, "I am not free while any woman is unfree." And she goes on to say, "Even when her shackles are different from my very own." So in my profession, we talk about intersectionality. I'm a diversity, equity, inclusion leader at a Fortune 50 company. So we talk a lot about intersectionality. And just to ground us all, it's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it highlights the overlapping dimensions of diversity among marginalized groups. And it really recognizes that someone's diversity can't be reduced just to a singular aspect. But the term provides a more holistic view of how, in this case, race and gender converge. So intersectionality accounts for how people interact within the workplace, and appreciating intersectionality will allow us to understand how folks with the compounding effects of having multiple dimensions. And so as I think about Audre Lorde's words, really they're a clarion call for every woman or for every ally to do their part in creating a more just and equitable world. So from an intersectional worldview, if a Black woman wins, don't we all win? If a Latina woman with disability wins, don't all women take a step forward? If women who identify as LGBTQIA wins, don't we all advance a little? So it's really seeing our struggle not just as a singular issue, but lending your voice to ensure women from all backgrounds win. So my challenge throughout this presentation will be thinking about how you use your influence, positions of power, and allyship to strive for equity and opportunity. So let's talk about the numbers. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, Black women are completing undergraduate degrees at a higher rate than any other group or gender. Yet, even as the most educated group in the US, there's a promotion gap. And at every level, going up the ladder of success, it gets less and less diverse. And this bears true in the data. Although women of color represent a higher rate of college graduates, according to a study by Lean In and McKinsey, only 4% of C-suite leaders are women of color. Additionally, the wage gap is persistent for women of color because the research think tank Catalyst and the Brookings Institute found that women make 79 cents for every dollar a man makes, and Black and Native American women make 64 and 60 cents on the dollar, respectively, while Latinx women only make 54 cents on the dollar. And if that isn't compelling enough, this diminished economic opportunity comes at a cost. So researchers at the Federal Reserve Board of San Francisco concluded that closing the racial and gender economic gap could have increased US GDP by $2.6 trillion in 2019. So closing the gender pay gap and ensuring that there is economic opportunity for all would have a catalytic impact, not only just for women of color, but for all Americans. So it matters. In 2019, just to frame us in thinking about the size of the population, when we speak about women of color, they represented 20.3% of the US population in 2019. And it's important to note that by the year 2060, women of color will be the majority at 53.4%. So if we don't create pay parity, or if organizations don't address the structural things that limit opportunity, our economic opportunity as a country is at risk. So when you think about what we can do about that, next slide. I think it's important to talk about our own individual experiences. So I'll share a little bit of my own. And I think about all of the ways that I was told to tone it down, or that as I share my ideas, that maybe I should create space for other people to talk. And so the next slide really bears witness to that. I'm sorry, can you flip back one slide, please? One more. All right. So, because I want to share a little bit about what we see in the workplace, and I've listed the sources here, so I invite you to go look at. One comes from a Great Place to Work study, where it talks about the research, which shows that Black women face bigger hurdles for promotions, and that they're actually evaluated more critically and report higher instances of bias in professional settings. And then when we think about the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, which looks at on a per capita basis how groups are performing, it shows that even at equal levels, Black women were rated more severely. And if you look at Forbes articles or Harvard Business Review articles, or even the election of Kamala Harris to the vice presidency of the US, she was frequently regarded as being too ambitious and told that she should set her sights lower. So now we'll talk about how I walked a tightrope. And I think about a time period in my professional career where I was in this space of not being able to make a mistake. So, forget, having to perform every day. The stakes were always high, no matter the project, no matter what I was being assigned, because I was one of only a few Black leaders. And I knew that this unfairly put a burden on me that I had to succeed, because if I didn't, those who look like me or other women of color may not be given an opportunity. And that's just not something my counterparts had to deal with. So I had to be astute, but not so astute that people would say, oh, you're a know it all. And I had to be a self starter, but not so much of a self starter that people would say, oh, you're not a team player. And it's really this process of mental Olympics that make it really challenging for women of color in the workplace. And if you layer on top of that microaggressions and all of the isms, it's downright exhausting. And there's actually a term for it, and it's called the emotional tax. And so, as women of color, we navigate the workplace, expending mental energy that could be spent on innovating or figuring out great ways to develop our teams or thinking about products that could better serve our clients. But instead, we're spending mental energy managing our tone, our delivery, and others' perception of us. So that's really a lose-lose situation. Let's talk about what we can do to fix it. So creating a more equitable workplace could look like having visual representation at all levels. And so it goes without saying that you can't tell your customers and your key stakeholders that you prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion if neither your boards nor your executive leadership teams reflect that. So it's important to take actionable steps to have representation at all levels so that you can actively demonstrate what you value and put it into action. There's a saying I love from a Harvard professor, Dr. Crystal Fleming, and she said, a budget is a moral document. And so if you don't have the representation today, it's incumbent upon you to look at what it's going to take to get there and to put the resources to ensure that you're able to reflect those things. I also think it's important to foster belonging and create a welcome environment where women of color can share their thoughts and opinions. And really, the subtext here is that women of color should not have their language policed. So there is this inescapable trope about women of color being depicted as angry, or when one speaks with passion, that they're, being misinterpreted. And so I think we need to normalize and welcome women of color to express the full range of emotions that their counterparts are allowed to express. So when you're in a meeting, and here's what it looks like. So when you're in a meeting and you hear a woman of color being talked over it, as an ally, you need to speak up. And it sounds like this. Hey, y'all, I appreciate this dialogue. I actually want to hear what Priya has to say. And you go back and give her the floor when you see that she's been mansplained or talked over, or when you're on a Zoom call and you notice that every time a woman of color speaks, her ideas are immediately discounted. That's when you, as an ally, need to speak up. And you can say something like, thanks, Bob. That sounds like a great idea. Keisha, I know you mentioned this earlier. Can you expound on it? And you yield the floor to her. So you give her a moment to present her ideas and create space for her to be acknowledged in that moment. And I think these and other things like coaching and training your team on microaggressions and non-inclusive behaviors will go a long way in creating an equitable environment. So now I want to invite you to talk to me. I'd like to see, and I'm asking you to put it in the chat, from where you sit, what can you do today to use your influence, your position of power, or your relationships to really create space to advance equity for women of color? So I want you to take a few moments and drop it in the chat for me. And the idea here is that there are so many different ways that each of us can show up. And so we just want to make sure we're being as intentional as possible. All righty, let's see. I'm going to see if there's some things coming through in the chat. Charlene, are you seeing anything?
There's a little bit of a delay, which the audience is aware of. So while we wait for people, I could pop up with you briefly and throw in what your question, my perspective, right?
Yeah.
What can you do from your place of influence? And I think your example of earlier, where when one of us lift someone else up, we all are lifted up. When one of us advances, we all have that step forward. And I think that that's so, so important. And a lot of us definitely can relate to that. And I think, like, from my place of influence, as a leader, as a manager within my own organization, I think the best thing that I always offer is making sure that everyone has that opportunity to share, right? Like your example, let's hear from so and so. So I never want to leave anyone out, regardless of if it's just no matter the gender, but whenever it's a team meeting, right? Sometimes you have that person who will mute and who will hide because they don't necessarily feel comfortable being the first one to jump in. So I mean, I hope I'm relating to people in the audience while we wait for people to also share their perspective and where they come from. But I always want to make sure everyone feels comfortable to say what they want to say. And we sometimes get in this loop of not wanting to speak out and not feeling supported when doing so, or not wanting to inconvenience the group. So I see. Whoa, here we go.
See some comments,
So,
right? Hey, thank y'all.
yes.
So,
Someone had mentioned listening and speaking out. Okay, wonderful to hear this. Someone else says,
and I want to expound on that, because it says being an ally is always speaking out, right? So it's not phoning it in. It's not resting in the comfort of not speaking up. It's saying, this is my core value. I want to stand in solidarity with people who don't look like me, with people who have different struggles. So ally is an action word. Like, in order to be an ally, you have to actively be using that. And I saw somebody else say listening and speaking out, calling it out. Someone said, as a woman of color, you mentor. Absolutely. You lift as you climb. And so you bring others along with you. There's a saying that says, when you make it to the top, be sure to send the elevator back down so someone else can come. So I love this idea. So someone says, pause and look around to see if you haven't heard from someone. So Charlene, that goes exactly to what you're saying on Zoom, asking a question. Hey, whomever, I love to hear from you. Do you mind unmuting? And hopefully that is that subtle reminder. Someone said, as a leader in the DE&I council, I make every effort to make sure everyone has the opportunity to speak. I think that that's really powerful. Someone said they represent those who may not have a seat at the table, normalize creating one for them. I think that is so powerful, because many times, especially if you have a diversity dimension that makes you the only one in the room, you are very aware and cognizant that there are other people around you who may look to you to represent your race or to represent your diversity dimension. So I think it's important to normalize having different people around the table. We actually did a campaign at my job to say, we're going to set a longer table. So it's not a zero-sum game. If I win, that doesn't mean you lose. If there are more people at the table, we're just going to set a longer table so that we can normalize again and ensure that representation matters. So thank you. I'm gonna keep going here. Alrighty. So, what does it look like, and what feelings does it create to be overlooked? So there were many points in my career where I had done twice as much or jumped over 3 times as many hurdles and was applauded for my work. And yet when it was time to dole out new titles or promotion, I was never rewarded accordingly. And so even if you start out as a beautiful, beaming achiever who is committed to the work and has a reputation for collaborating and is known as someone who can execute and get things done, being overlooked again and again can start to make you shrink. And it can even have the unfortunate it can even make you start to feel small. So I think that it's important to consider what we can do. So if you go to the next slide, please. I love the comments that you all share, because if we think about what opportunity for all women could look like, there is this sentiment that if as a woman of color, we're pulling someone up, Or if we're not a woman of color, how are we creating space? So there's a definition that I want to give of the word ally since it came up earlier. And this is from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And it says it's a person who uses their privilege to advocate on behalf of someone else who doesn't hold that same privilege. Allyship is the first action-oriented tool in their social justice and bias trainings. And allies are defined by their actions. So just to make it practical, allyship in action means speaking up when things aren't right. Allyship in action means not allowing your silence to be complicity. Allyship in action means using your spheres of influence to create practices and policies that work for everyone. And you may say, well, I don't have power. You have relationships with other people that others may not. And so, from wherever you sit, you have the opportunity to use your power and your influence to enact change. Allyship in action means leading with authenticity, sharing openly and honestly. And at the same time, allyship in action means practicing radical listening and recognizing your own biases. In short, allyship in action means practicing courage and not being satisfied with the status quo if the status quo isn't working for everyone. So, as we talk about what it looks like to create more equitable workplaces, it's important to think about this concept of psychological safety. And do women of color feel safe, feel supported, feel that their voice matters, feel that when they speak up, they are heard, feel that when they share, they are not dismissed? And if it's not, it's important to create an environment where that is actually the norm. And we talked about placing undue burdens for people to represent their entire race or represent their entire identity, and that's not fair. So it's about fostering inclusive environment and getting away from those ultra high stakes environment where you only have one person representing a particularly diverse dimension and they have to perform. We talked about the emotional tax, and so it's important to look at how your employees are feeling. I heard earlier the session earlier talking about assessing your employees, doing listening sessions, taking inventory of how people are feeling. I think that's critical because you can uncover some spots where people may not feel supported. And on the topic of representation, which we touched on earlier, it's important to analyze and disaggregate your data by race. And so whether that's your promotion data, your retention data, whether that is your attrition data, understanding how people are either exiting or growing within your organization will give you the baseline so that you can measure success over time. And then as we move to the final dimensions, we talk about microaggressions. And microaggressions can start to make you feel invisible because of some of the dynamics I mentioned earlier, which are that if you are direct, people say that you're not a team player, or if you issue a credible challenge to someone, it may be misconceived as you're being angry. So a lot of times when there are microaggressions taking place, women of color suffer in silence, feeling that they don't have the recourse to be able to speak up, or feeling unsupported within that organization to speak up. So I love this quote that really sort of says it's not our differences that divides us, it's the inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And a lot of times when there are microaggressions taking place again and again, it really is the instance of someone lacking understanding, someone not being as familiar with the group, someone not having the cultural context to know that what they just said was inappropriate. And so as we talk about fostering a more equitable workplace, I think that there are specific things that we can do. So it's looking at our evaluation processes and reinforcing diversity, equity, and inclusion through your evaluation process. Bayer Monsanto is a company here in St. Louis that uses a 360 evaluation to measure the extent to which managers are leading inclusively. So they actually quantify it and they use that number to say, this is what your bonus is going to be, or this is how you're going to be how your bonus is going to be diminished. And I think that's critical because it's not enough to have blacked out your social media. It's not enough to have issued a statement following the death of George Floyd. It is an iterative process, and it's a constant uncovering of the things that aren't working for people of color within your organization and being committed to addressing those things. That literally is the definition of equity. It is identifying what's not working, and leveling the playing field so that the disparities no longer exist. And so as you think about moving to a place where you're actually leading in diversity, equity, inclusion, that will require you to hold your leaders accountable in a more intentional way. And embedding that into your talent review process, I think is going to be very helpful. Also, identifying diverse talent and intentionally elevating those leaders in the talent review process is going to be helpful. And then instituting sponsorship efforts to facilitate relationship building. So I know there is a lag, but I would love to hear from each of you on this question on the next slide, which is, how will you use your voice? So I've rolled out a litany of ways that you can in the moment share feedback in the in sort of macro level and also micro level, and thinking about your systems, your structures, your policies, and also your day-to-day interactions. So please share with me, what are you committing to do today? And how can you, again, use your voice and your position of power and your place of influence to create a more equitable workplace for women of color? So as those answers are coming in, I like to leave you with a quote as we wrap up, and finish where we started, which is a quote by Audre Lorde. And she said, "Life is very short. What we have to do must be done now." And essentially, if we are going to prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, it's not something that can be put off. It's not something that can wait. It has to be done now. And it's going to take all of us. And so I would love to hear how you are committing to move this ball further down the field. Someone says, as a leader, they're going to share. This is a question that came with us. It says, share with us how white women can create equitable spaces for women of color. What does that look like? I think it looks like speaking up as promotion and decisions to advance people are happening. I think it means intentionally building your network to ensure that not everyone looks like you. I think it's looking at the people on your team, creating stretch assignments to get them to the next level. I think it's taking a look at your recruiting process to understand, are there places where maybe there are a ton of women of color applicants, but the end candidate slate does not reflect that? Then that would be sort of a red flag that there's probably something in your hiring practice that is not enabling women of color to prevail. I think it is listening, and women of color will tell you in a constructive way. So I want to stick a pin there and say that it is not the burden of women of color to lay out a strategy for your diversity, equity, inclusion plan, to take on an additional emotional tax of having to process other people's reactions to the social justice issues, and having to be a sounding board. By women of color will tell you, if you give them an opportunity and say, what do you need? How can we support you? What could this organization be doing differently? I guarantee you people will have some ideas and solutions and feedback for you. So lastly, I'd just like to thank you for allowing me to be here. Again, I would love to keep this conversation going on social media at Desiree S Coleman. I appreciate each of you and your commitment to advance equity. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Charlene. Thank you.
Thank you, Desiree. Thank you so much. We absolutely still have people who have the ability to answer some of those questions in the chat function. We still have more sessions throughout today. And we do have an answer here, Desiree, if you see that. Recommend colleagues who may not be known or visible for open positions for which they would be great. Proactively praise colleagues' excellent work, collaboration, service with their managers. I anticipate a couple more answers coming in, and we do have about one more minute until our next session. But I want to thank you again, Desiree. And I agree with this first comment in terms of also what I could do with my team. And so I think a lot of what people are sharing is we find a lot of common threads there. And I think we all feel very similar. There's another comment right there. You just inspired me. I'd like to purposely pair women of color with mentors in our organization to develop their careers. we have keepers, and I'd hate to lose them regardless of their position. So I think this has been wonderful, Desiree, and I thank you so much for spending some of your time and dedication to this service and this work and joining us here today. And so with that, I wish you thank you, goodbye, and we'll get ready for our next presentation, and have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.